Brian Lehrer on WNYC, another Health Tuesday segment. Since September, the U.S. military has carried out 20 strikes, as you probably heard, on boats allegedly smuggling fentanyl in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, killing at least 80 people, not the fentanyl, the U.S. military strikes. President Trump has claimed, with no evidence, that each destroyed boat saves the life of 25,000 Americans, presumably by stopping the flow of fentanyl into the country. It's the Trump administration's expedient solution to a complicated problem. America could be made, quote, great again if drug trafficking could only be stopped, if we could only go back to the days before the fentanyl crisis, which is real. But our next guest argues that, quote, there is no wholesome, traditional, drug-free America that we can return to. Americans have always used a lot of drugs, even in the white suburbs and rural areas that Mr. Trump supporters call the real America, unquote. This comes from the article called I Am a Drug Historian. Trump is wrong about fentanyl in almost every way. So joining us now is David Herzberg, professor of history and director of the Drugs, Health, and Society program at the University at Buffalo. Professor Herzberg, thanks for your article. Thanks for sharing it with us. Welcome to WNYC.
Thanks for having me.
You write that the first drug crisis came in the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. Tell us that story.
Yeah, so this is a period of time in which the American economy was undergoing industrialization, and so shifting to mass production of new high-tech products that were sold far and wide. And among those new products were more powerful drugs, such as morphine, which was isolated from the opium poppy, and cocaine, which was isolated from the coca plant. And the traditional market protections in America could be described as caveat emptor, or let the buyer beware. And this works in small scale markets where you know the people selling and you're familiar with the products. But it was kind of a disaster in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with all these new products produced by unknown concerns that might be far away. And so in the headlines of that era were all sorts of consumer tragedies, such as women blinded by toxic cosmetics or babies starved to death on swill milk, which looked like milk, but which was incredibly watery. And among those were a sharp increase in addiction to morphine, eventually heroin and cocaine, because these products were available and there were very few limits on how they could be sold. The majority of addiction came from people who went to see doctors and got prescribed these medications because that was the largest market for them. And so it was right there in the doctor visiting classes. In other words, those people with enough money to see a doctor, they weren't particularly in cities, they were overwhelmingly white. And so that was the first sort of drug crisis that looked similar to the initial stages of today's opioid crisis.
Yeah, pharmaceutical prescriptions, in today's case, of course, painkillers, and then people get hooked and turn to street drugs. I mean, that's an eerie echo of what is happening today from that long ago.
Yeah, definitely. And, it really underscores the main point, which is that our drug crisis wasn't caused by foreign traffickers. So it can't be solved by declaring a war on foreign traffickers. And in fact, history suggests that's likely to make things worse. And we can see an example from just our most recent opioid crisis, that transition you identified from people who were using pharmaceutical opioids, switching to street drug use. Why did that happen? That happened because when authorities wanted to take action to do something about a growing crisis of addiction to pharmaceutical opioids, the action they took was sort of one of these drug war type actions in which they said, the problem is people are abusing these drugs and we need to stop selling drugs to people who are addicted to them. This was the line of the pharmaceutical industry. This was the line of the first round response. But of course, people who are addicted to a drug are very strongly motivated to keep buying it. And so when they couldn't buy in what I call white markets, those legal pharmaceutical markets, they looked elsewhere to buy. And this created a mismatch in supply and demand in America because illicit market opioids, what I call prohibition markets, they were they were 20th century old-fashioned markets. They were located in major cities. You had to go there predominantly to buy them. And that wasn't where these folks who had become addicted to pharmaceuticals were living. So you had a lot of people who wanted to spend money on opioids, and you didn't have enough people who were trying to sell them opioids. And that's where the new suppliers stepped in. And these new suppliers were they were modernizers. They said, wait, why should we deal with farms and farmers and goo extracted with a scalpel from a flower when we can make a synthetic product? And instead of sending it to one of these 20th century central markets where everyone has to go to, we'll bring it to where the consumers are, just like the e-commerce revolution. And so this attempt to shut off the supply with this drug war type policy ended up changing the market in ways that were incredibly dangerous for these people who had developed an addiction. They shifted from using a regulated product that was exactly what it said on the label to using unregulated, unlabeled products that turned out to be much more potent and dangerous in the case of fentanyl, which is the synthetic product that they shifted to.
Is this related to what you call in your piece the white market rather than the black market, this kind of long-term game of cat and mouse between drug companies and drug regulators?
Yeah, so white markets, of course, are the legal pharmaceutical medical markets that sell the products that are probably in many of your listeners' medicine cabinets. And this cat and mouse game is between authorities who want to restrain and regulate those markets in the name of public health. These are desirable products, they're good products, but they're also can be really dangerous. So you want to have careful safeguards. The companies selling them tend to believe that they are much less dangerous than authorities do, and they want to sell them much more easily and with fewer restrictions. And so sometimes authorities get the upper hand and these markets are reined in really carefully. And sometimes the manufacturers get the upper hand and they break free and are able to sell a lot of products. We saw that, we already talked about the late 19th century with morphine and cocaine. This happened again from about the 1950s to the 1970s with sedatives and stimulants. So I'm talking about barbiturate sleeping pills, Valium, that's an anti-anxiety drug, and amphetamine, which at the time was used for dieting and as an antidepressant. Huge public health crisis related to too easy sale of all these drugs because the industry had gotten one step ahead of the regulators and were able to sell them kind of like hotcakes. Then when that got reined in the 70s, the next time that the industry won this cat and mouse game was with the beginnings of the opioid crisis in the 1990s.
Listeners, I imagine some of you read this article with the very sticky title that probably made you click on it if you were on the New York Times website. I am a drug historian. Trump is wrong about fentanyl in almost every way. It is David Herzberg, professor of history and director of the Drugs, Health, and Society program at the University at Buffalo, who has a story or a question or a comment. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. You can call or you can text. There is kind of a tension here, isn't there, between the desire to not overprescribe so that you don't, whether it's, barbiturates or today's opioids or whatever happened in the Gilded Age more than 100 years ago, so that you don't overprescribe and get people addicted in those ways, but you also don't underprescribe. I mean, we once did a segment on the show a number of years ago about concerns that patients were allowed to remain in pain too much because doctors didn't want to prescribe potentially addictive painkillers.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and I'm glad you brought it up. We have a system, it's kind of like a two-stage engine, that cat and mouse game. And our system tends to overshoot the mark in both directions. So we overshoot the mark and oversell drugs. This is, the opioid crisis was caused not by patients getting too many opioids, but by communities being flooded by opioids. 3/4 of the people who developed an opioid addiction to pharmaceutical opioids had never been prescribed an opioid themselves. It was because it was a community was flooded with pills. It was just so easy for anybody to get access to them. So you have that one problem of flooding communities with a dangerous drug with insufficient warnings about the potential dangers. And then the other problem, when that happens, our reaction afterwards is to slam down the walls really hard, just like what happened when I said authorities responded to this crisis of flooding by shutting off people who were long-term users of opioids. And that has had a devastating effect. And so we lurch from one extreme policy to the other, and we ignore the hard work of building a policy that delivers the drugs that people need. Everybody agrees these are incredibly important drugs. Fentanyl is an incredibly important drug in its proper place. And we really need to think pragmatically about how to deliver these drugs the way that we want them to be delivered, instead of either having them flooding communities because of the profit motive or being slammed shut in a kind of a ham-handed way because of the political value of declaring a war against drugs.
But in the contemporary era, enter fentanyl, and you write that it came to dominate the market because of its suitability for smuggling, not because consumers particularly wanted it. Explain.
Yeah, so when this generation of people who had become addicted first to pharmaceutical opioids, then they switched, and at first they were able to buy heroin, although it required some changes in the market. As far as we're able to tell from studies at the time, when fentanyl first appeared, they actually didn't like it. It had a slightly different subjective sensation that wasn't what they were familiar with and wanted. And it's a shorter acting drug. And so you needed to buy it and use it more often, which is really inconvenient. And of course, it's much more potent, so there's a greater degree of danger. So why did it appear if people didn't want it? And this is because prohibition markets, and I use that term instead of black markets because it makes it clear that because this kind of policy doesn't eliminate drugs, it's really just another set of incentives in a market. Prohibition markets incentivize products that are easier to smuggle. And fentanyl, about 100 times more powerful than other opioids that were available at the time, that meant you needed to move less of it to produce the same number of doses to sell. In other words, it's going to be more profitable per unit of weight. And it's also going to be easier to smuggle because it doesn't involve farmers and farms. The supply chain is much more streamlined. And because it's so small, you can evade detection. So in other words, in a white market, at least in theory, there are incentives to produce and sell in a way that takes into account consumer safety. That label, it says what it is, and it has to be accurate. The person selling it, their goal is the well-being of the person who's buying it. Of course, all in theory. But in a prohibition market, none of those things are there. There are no incentives for good manufacturing or safe, accurate labeling. It's just as illegal to sell high quality fentanyl that's mixed perfectly and is accurately labeled as it is to sell poor quality fentanyl that or even to be selling cocaine, claiming to be selling cocaine that is actually fentanyl, right? It's all illegal. So we give up on our ability to say to a producer, if you want to enter this market and make money selling to people, you have to meet these standards and you have to produce products that with consumer safety in mind. So in those prohibition markets, fentanyl is a great product, but for prohibition market consumers, it's been incredibly deadly.
As we continue with David Herzberg, professor of history and director of the Drugs, Health, and Society program at the University of Buffalo, author of the New York Times essay called I Am a Drug Historian, Trump is Wrong About Fentanyl in Almost Every Way. And we're going to go to some of your calls and texts now at 212-433, WNYC 433-9692. Professor, here's something from a text message. Says, I would honestly have no problem with the attacks on these boats if they did, in fact, remove fentanyl, legal or otherwise. That said, I think it is a ruse because his base likes fireworks. It appeals to the base. So talk about the effectiveness, or your premise is not effectiveness, of taking out these drug boats, even if they are carrying a lot of fentanyl.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. There's no evidence that I've seen that Venezuela supplies any fentanyl to the United States or is a significant source of any other drug. But let's just say that they did have fentanyl in them. Here's the problem. When you cut off a supply chain, right? So fentanyl is now coming into the United States. If you cut off the supply chain, you still have a bunch of people who are highly committed to buying fentanyl, right? And those people are still going to be seeking out people selling them fentanyl. This will create a moment of market disruption where you have a mismatch between demand and supply. And that invites in new suppliers to meet that demand. And let's say nobody does it right away. They're afraid of being blown up. The prices for fentanyl will go up because there's high demand and low supply. Eventually, those prices will reach a height where someone is going to say, dang it, I'm going to give it a try. There's a lot of money to be made here. And we've seen this happen again and again over the last 150 years, that when you shut down one supply chain without doing anything about the demand, new supply chains come in. And because this is an illegal supply chain, right, this moment of disruption invites competition. And where there are no rules, hey, competition can get quite violent. This is just one important point that the US has suffered a lot of death and harm due to our misguided drug policies, but countries south of our border have suffered even worse because of the violence that gets associated with these moments of disruption. So really, you need to do something about both sides of this. It's clear that fentanyl is a bad product. The people selling fentanyl are just as responsible for that bad product as the opioid industry was for flooding communities with opioids. I have no desire to excuse them for selling this dangerous product, but we need to work on both sides of the equation. We need to find ways to insist that suppliers be responsible and protect the public health. And we also need to work with our domestic population and provide support that is needed for people with addiction to fentanyl, including access to safer opioids that can keep them from dying from this dangerous product.
Norm in Manhattan has a personal story, I think. Norm, you're on WNYC. Thank you so much for calling in.
You're welcome. Hi, Brian. Love your show. I think the professor is overlooking one drug that achieved mass popularity and was probably the most overprescribed drug during the 70s, and that was Quaaludes. And a number of manufacturers manufactured Quaaludes. Aurora manufactured Quaaludes. SmithKline and French had a variation of Quaaludes. Park Davis had a variation of Quaaludes until the FDA totally banned it and took it off the market, period, exclamation point. So you have not been able to buy Quaaludes here for quite a while. My own experience is it was the first drug that really got me in trouble. And when I could no longer get a script for Quaaludes, I switched to barbiturates, which were freely available. So we're talking about the old push-down, pop-up effect. And that's what still goes on. That's what still drives the drug market today. And then barbiturates led me to Placidals, which is still prescribed as a hypnotic, all fueled with alcohol. So I think you have to look at the overall effect. You can ban fentanyl, and I've had surgeries that use fentanyl, and I'm very grateful that fentanyl was used. But you can ban fentanyl, street use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and before you could shake a stick, something else is going to pop up for sure. I know heroin has been substituted, and I'm very happy that I've been substance-free for a number of years. And I still follow the industry, and I still follow the comments and articles and programs like yours, Brian.
Norm, thank you so much for telling that story, which I think, Professor Herzberg, completely exemplifies the arc of history that you've been describing in this segment and that you describe in your article, which is banning a particular drug doesn't solve the problem very often because then another drug pops up to replace it if the demand is still there. So in your experience, from your expertise as a drug and society, expert and professor, what does reduce demand?
Well, it's the Quaalude example is really interesting and instructive on that front, because one thing I'm going to say is that it's not clear that demand can or even should be reduced. Using psychoactive substances is a pretty normal human behavior. The question is, under what circumstances does that normal human behavior become harmful? And that's what we need to try to prevent or to reduce. But in the case of Quaaludes, are help demonstrate this, because Quaaludes is an example of, believe it or not, a success story, because we talk about this pop-up effect. You ban one drug and another shows up. The only reason that happens is because we let that happen, right? That in most markets, we're pretty good at capitalism. We tailor markets to provide the products that we want. With drugs, we don't do that, so that when we shut off OxyContin, then heroin pops up, and shut off heroin, then fentanyl pops up. This is something we can actually make deliberate choices about, and that's what happened with Quaalude. You have a whole class of drugs called sedatives that include barbiturates and benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax and Klonopin, and they don't all present the same degree of risk and danger to users. And in the case of Quaalude, when they banned Quaalude, for number one, they did it slowly over time, and number two, they didn't ban all of the drugs of that class. So people who used Quaalude could shift to a different drug, which could be less dangerous. And the caller switched to barbiturates. A more common one was to switch to Valium, which of course Valium has its dangers, and this isn't a perfect outcome, but it's a better outcome, and that's sort of what we're looking at, because we can't reprogram humans to not want to use psychoactive substances. This seems to be part of who we are. What we can do is introduce frictions into the marketplace that make it harder to get more dangerous substances, and can encourage people to stick with the ones that we have a lot of experience with, we know how to use safely, and so on and so forth. So in that case, I think that we have a responsibility to not live in an imaginary world where it's possible to just get people to stop wanting to use drugs. I study this in American history. There hasn't been a time in American history where that was true. We started with the Gilded Age. We could go back to the American Revolution. Mm-hmm. Historians in my field call the period after the Revolution the Alcoholic Republic, because of a huge boom in drinking. So in other words, we need to change our target from drugs to drug harm.
One more call. Al in Summit. You're on WNYC. Hi, Al.
Hi. Yes, my name's Al Pock. I worked for a number of years in drug research, including, working at times with the DEA. And they've had a very standard way of interdicting boats coming in bringing drugs, in terms of stopping them, boarding them, searching them, arresting the people, if they were smuggling drugs, and capturing the drugs. And so it's been effective. And of course it could use more money to do this kind of interdiction against blowing up boats, whether you don't even know if they have drugs and you have no connection to what the supply line is. So it's completely counterproductive. And it is, as people say, a kind of extrajudicial killing of people, without any kind of adjudication or evidence. And so it must be more for show or for other reasons than real drug interdiction.
With your experience, Al, how would you respond to this argument that we may hear from the Trump people, which is that the old style of interdiction, arresting people after you board the boats if you really find drugs, obviously didn't solve the problem from the supply side, because the fentanyl crisis has only gotten worse. And so if you blow up some boats, kill a few people, you're really going to dissuade people from taking that risk. What would you say to that?
Well, you can make that argument. It's the same argument as taking children away from their parents to scare people to come to the United States. There's a moral question involved. Number one, you could be killing innocent people. Number two, it seems that the drug interdiction, in terms of the international waters, was not funded that heavily. So that's another reason why, it didn't have the exact effect people want.
What would happen to the people who were arrested in those interdictions? Were they jailed in the United States? Were they deported back to their countries? Do you happen to know through your experience?
No, I'm not sure, but I'm sure there was a range of different, kinds of responses to them.
Al, thank you for your call. We really appreciate you sharing your experience in this area. So last question, Professor Herzberg, why not an all of the above strategy if there are so many opioid deaths in this country and so much opioid addiction that causes other kinds of suffering, even for people who remain alive? Why not work on the demand side, the quality of life side, reducing even for people who use drugs, the possibility of overdoses, and at the same time work on trying to, through interdiction or whatever, reduce the supply?
That sounds great to me, actually. And the thing is, if we want to get practical about doing something about the supply side, that's exactly what we would need to do. We can't leave a huge vacuum of profit to be made by supplying people with, fentanyl's a terrible product. Our policy shifted suppliers to the point that they were supplying fentanyl instead of heroin. As weird as it may sound to say, it would be a supply side win if we shifted those markets back to heroin. It's a safer product.
Wow.
Right? And so this, to me, I think we do need to be really robust about dealing with supply. I just think the idea that we can eliminate the supply on its own isn't realistic, not going to be effective, and it's going to make things worse. We need to be hard-headed and practical about the supply and use the tools we've developed all through the rest of capitalism to get that supply to look the way that we want it to look instead of pretending we can make it disappear.
David Herzberg, professor of history and director of the Drugs, Health, and Society program at the University at Buffalo. His New York Times piece is called "I Am a Drug Historian. Trump is Wrong About Fentanyl in Almost Every Way." Thank you for coming on with us.
Thank you for having me.